Hello, and welcome back to Stories Sustain Us, where we explore the incredible journeys of individuals dedicated to making our world a better place. I'm your host, Stephen Shower, and today's episode promises to be both enlightening and inspiring. Joining us is Dr. Burke Hales, a brilliant mind whose career spans from chemical engineering to oceanography, driven by a deep passion for understanding our planet's oceans. In this episode, we'll learn about Dr. Hales' groundbreaking research on the dynamics of carbon dioxide in ocean sediments and the development of real-time monitoring instruments which are contributing to the health of marine ecosystems and even help save the shellfish aquaculture industry from collapse. Additionally, we'll dive into his leadership role in the PacWave project, aimed at harnessing wave energy for sustainable power. Dr. Hales will also share his insights on the importance of storytelling in science, the challenges of academia, and the collaborative efforts needed for future ocean infrastructure projects. Dr. Burke Hales is a professor at the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University, and he is the chief scientist at PacWave. He specializes in biochemical oceanography, and his current research is focused on coastal ocean carbon cycles, ocean acidification, and measurement and experimental manipulation technology. His dedication to understanding and mitigating climate change through ocean chemistry and renewable energy technologies highlights the critical need for diverse and collective solutions. Stay tuned as we uncover the fascinating story of Dr. Burke Hales and his mission to turn the tide on climate change, one wave at a time. Here on Stories Sustain Us, where we are inspiring action through the power of storytelling. Well, good morning, Dr. Hales. How are you this morning?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm also doing well. Thank you for joining me on Stories Sustain Us. I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on and talking to us about wave energy and some of the interesting work that you're doing with PacWave down in Oregon. So looking forward to jumping into that. But first, let's jump into your story.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, Dr. Hales. Where'd you grow up and how'd you get to eventually get to Oregon State University and the work you're doing there?
Well, I grew up mostly in Washington State. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, while my dad was finishing his PhD. And he moved quickly over to Pacific Northwest National Laboratory.
Oh, nice.
And so from my, age 2.5, maybe, through, uh, depends on when you say you left home.
Sure.
So I was an undergrad and a graduate student at the University of Washington.
Okay.
And so I ended up spending a long time at the University of Washington because I moved from a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and then certain twist of events. I did the first year of my postdoc, which was actually hosted at Columbia University's observatory. And so I spent over a decade in Seattle through my undergrad, graduate, and first year postdoc. And then spent a couple of years in New York at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory.
Okay.
Before landing the job at Oregon State, and I've been there ever since. And it's I still feel like the new guy, but it's been almost 27 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's a little bit of time, but feeling new is still good. There's some excitement that comes with that. So, right. Let me take you back in time a little bit and tell me. So, growing up then here in Washington, I'm actually in Seattle.
Okay.
Moved here a couple years ago myself from San Antonio, so I'm still the new guy here in the Seattle area. But what was life growing up? Brothers and sisters? Were you outdoors a lot? What was kind of some of your childhood experiences growing up in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, as I'm sure you're realizing, the Pacific Northwest is not monolithic. And growing up in Eastern Washington is very, very different than it's been in Seattle.
Yeah.
And so, as a school kid, as a teenager, living in the Columbia Basin.
Yeah.
lots of fishing, lots of exploring, lots of time on the water. And then, of course, when you live in a town like that, you have to play football, and
Sure.
so I was living the redneck dream in a lot of ways, and but at the same time, folks were educated, and we traveled. My dad ran the atmospheric chemistry laboratory at Battelle, being in Richland. He had a couple of not quite sabbatical stints with the University of Stockholm, and so.
Oh, nice.
There.
Yeah.
And then both my mom and dad's families, extended families, were in Seattle. They were Seattle kids. So we spent lots of time, lots of holidays, and lots of time there in Seattle. So I really didn't have any, culture shock transition when I became a Seattleite. And so, yeah, very different, but I appreciate that diversity.
Yeah.
And sort of, lifestyle and perspective for sure.
Yeah. I haven't had a chance to explore too much of Eastern Washington yet myself. I know kind of some of the high plains, desert kind of feel of it.
Right.
I know it has some feel probably to the West Texas aspect of what I am familiar with a little bit.
People have asked me this question before, what's it like growing up over there? So the Battelle, PNNL, they're all, affiliated, in some ways more loosely than others with the nuclear facility.
Yeah.
The Hanford project. So huge energy and defense drivers of identity of that community, and at the same time also a lot of very conservative religions out there, and
sure,
and certainly back then towns were much smaller. The Tri-Cities is probably quadrupled since I lived there, and so the football games, the high school football games were huge deals. Thousands of people would show up.
Friday night lights. Yeah,
exactly. I said it's probably about as close to growing up in Texas as you can be without being in Texas. This energy defense industry dominance, dry, rural, sort of conservative, social perspective. So, there were things about it that I loved. There were things about it that I really didn't. So yeah, that's that background. And I think my sister is an educator, and she works at what they call a student curriculum driven high school, where essentially the students do projects,
self-driven projects.
The projects, they don't necessarily have a set curriculum, but the projects have requirements to meet all of the state mandated metrics for English language, history, science, etc.
Sure.
And so she's working with, some very, different learning perspective kids, and very, very fascinated by the sort of, how do our brains mature, and where I'm coming back around to it. He said people's brains mature sort of by making mistakes.
Yeah.
And that, kids don't make mistakes in the same way we used to. And so, the things that I did, not illegal. But,
right on the edge. Yeah. Probably my story similar.
Yeah, we did things, on the river in the winter as kids, unsupervised, and back in the pickup down on the gravel bar, and running the boat out to hunt ducks on islands in the middle of the river in, January, and sort of, almost not quite free range kids, but no, there were no cell phones telling anybody where we were.
Yeah.
And you think, we never got, really in trouble, but looking back on it now, especially thinking about my kids, and never have let them do those things alone.
Sure.
I would have participated with them had they been interested, but yeah, so it's you grew up in a different way. You gain sort of an independence and self-sufficiency. And I think you see a lot of the Gen Xers out there talking about, you know, our parents really had no idea what we were doing.
Yeah.
And so that really is important. And again, thinking about how kids' brains develop, I felt like, you know, I could pretty much fend for myself.
Yeah. Take on the world. Yeah.
One way to call it. Yeah. And again, a lot of accidents in there, narrowly averted disasters that probably shaped that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've thought often about the difference between my childhood and like you said, now, with the cell phones, thank goodness there wasn't photographic evidence of some of the things that I was probably doing that was, again, on the edge of probably shouldn't have been doing, but,
Right.
but survived.
Yeah, right. Nobody died, right?
Exactly. So talk a little bit about that transition, then moving from, the eastern part of Washington, a more conservative part of the state for those who are under the mythology that Washington state is this solid blue monolith. It is not. So you're moving from a conservative part of the state to,
Right.
the maybe the heart of blue Washington, King County, Seattle area. So what was that transition like as a 17, 18, 19-year-old?
Well, like I said, my parents were educated. They were progressives.
Sure.
And I had lots of, one of the trips to Sweden, to Sweden, my dad did with us on that trip. And, we did things like bought rail passes and just left.
Traveled around, yeah.
3 weeks.
Nice.
Kicked it off with a David Bowie.
Oh, wow.
So,
yeah.
It was quite we were
obviously
teenagers and Americans, and when David Bowie sang Young Americans, all the Swedes in the stadium around us were pointing at us. And so, in a lot of ways, like I said, I didn't really, and I knew Seattle somewhat, right? But, I had exposure to things like public transportation.
Right.
Navigating, crowded city streets. That was in some ways not much of a culture shock. The thing, that was interesting, kind of went from being, the most liberal person in the old community to being, the only one in the new community that really had those kinds of Eastern Washington experiences.
Exposures, right.
And so, it's, and, again, that's fine. It's just, I never seem to quite land in at the mode of the population.
Yeah.
And sort of where it goes.
Yeah.
And that wasn't, I didn't find that to be, probably either.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then, I got my bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. And had started down that path, from thinking from an early age, preteen, that wanted to do something.
Yeah.
And I was good at math, I was good at chemistry. And I had, one of these rare moments of good judgment where I thought, well, probably I don't want to, become a marine biologist. Probably think about something with an employment potential to it. And so
sure. That's some good judgment for an 18-year-old.
Yeah, right. Uncommonly, there are a couple of times where I made the right decision that I don't honestly know, how I managed to do it, but certainly getting that training was important. And then for your Seattle compatriots and for my fellow undergraduate engineers, engineering is really hard. It's a really, really challenging curriculum, and
yeah.
Sometimes your fellow engineers are maybe not the most social people. I'm a little bit of an introvert myself, and so then you end up on that massive campus in winter term when you're broke because you're trying to save all the money you can to, buy a, buy a 6-pack of beer on the weekend,
Sure.
and it's cold, and it's dark,
Yeah.
and I remember, that we had these all-day laboratories, and you would go in there, walk across campus, cold and wet, go down to the basement of this building, and do these all-day laboratories, and windowless,
Yep.
and then you come back out, at 4 o'clock, and
Back into the darkness. Yep.
it's still cold and it's still rainy, and really, just thought, man, I don't know if academia is for me. I don't know if Seattle is for me.
Sure.
It was a challenging time, and so I just decided, forget this advanced degree stuff. I'm gonna get a job. I need to make some money. I need to not be on a college campus. I need to not be cold and wet all the time. So I bought a suit and interviewed, with Exxon and
Yeah.
chemical companies, and was basically okay with the idea of moving to Refineryville, Mississippi, and then the fall of my senior year, the stock market crashed, and huge. That was the Black Tuesday, I think is what they called it.
Yeah, I remember that.
October of '87.
Yep.
And just every big company stopped.
Yeah.
So the 3 or 4 best students in my cohort were getting an offer here, and I was not one of those. And so I thought, what am I going to do here? And coincidentally, during one of these all-day laboratories, one of the professors from oceanography came up and gave a talk about the suitability of chemical engineers for chemical oceanography. I didn't really know there were such things.
Yeah.
And I missed that seminar because I was in this lab. But I wandered down the hill, down to South Campus, and stuck my head in the student admissions office and said, so, what do I do? And they said, well, send us your GRE scores. And I said, I don't know what the GRE is.
Sure.
And ended up, taking it on a week's notice on standby. I went into,
Nice.
I'm trying to remember, the Kane Hall there on the University of Washington campus, huge 1,000 student auditorium, waiting for somebody to not show. So
you jump in. Yeah.
Basically didn't have any time to get stressed out about it. So I did pretty well. And then started applying to graduate schools. And one of my, maybe this is my third good decision in this conversation, is I was getting interest from some other schools, and I won't name locations or names.
Sure.
But in the South, and I was thinking, wow, warm sounds really good. And I went into an interview with one of the faculty members there, who sort of the first thing he said was, have you noticed how beautiful the women on our campus are?
Huh.
I said, yeah.
Interesting recruiting tactic. Yeah.
22 years old,
Yeah.
I have eyes.
Yeah.
And then he said, so are you single? And I said, yeah. And he said, this is a great place to be single. And, my 22-year-old male brain wasn't necessarily just rejecting that out of hand.
Sure.
But I got back from that trip and thought, there are many reasons that people make decisions. I should probably not make a career decision based on the appeal of that location. And so, after swearing I'd never set foot one more minute on a college campus than I had to, and wanted to get out of Seattle as soon as I could. I just, walked the half mile down the hill to to the oceanography campus
Yeah.
and spent the next 10 years there. So, uh, it, not the next 10, the next 7.
Yeah.
Uh, and, and so, and here I go. And so, the stock market crash really forced my hand. I don't know if I can take credit for that decision. I do every once in a while,
We had some
peer,
choices to make there. Yeah.
yeah, I do every once in a while peer into I get to look into the corporate engineering world and think, man, what killed me.
Yeah.
And so, really bad fortune for all those investors. Really good fortune for me because I would take more jobs, without question. Realized 3 or 4 years later that I had made a mistake.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, that more or less got me in the oceanography field. And then, again, fortuitously, my thesis project was looking at carbon dioxide chemistry dynamics in deep ocean sediments.
Okay.
And and then my postdoc, I transferred to work with Dr. Taro Takahashi, who's sort of one of the icons of the ocean CO2 measurement world, and worked with him on a surface ocean CO2 project. Go to Antarctica.
Nice.
Uh, and and ultimately, sort of throughout that process, my sort of engineer's sensibility stuck with me, and so I ended up building most of the tech that I used for my
Okay.
measurements, and developing numerical computational tools to analyze that data, which was kind of all of it was kind of a you know new way of looking at things. You had to think about how to analyze that data in different ways, and so
Yeah.
I was again, I was maybe the most applied scientist in this community of basic researchers, and 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 so it's again sort of not quite being right there
Yeah. Well, it gave you,
in
I'm
the
sure,
one
some
sigma distribution of perspectives.
right. Gives you a different way to look at the world when you're collaborating with those peers. It gives you a different perspective, which I'm sure served you well.
Well, yeah, and then I get started in with PacWave, and that's very much an engineering project. So now I'm suddenly pure scientist
Yeah.
in a room full of engineers.
Yeah. Well,
So yeah, it's been a fun project.
let me ask you one before we transition into PacWave. We're kind
Sure.
of at a good place here, but before we do that, something a thought I wanted to dig a little deeper around. You'd mentioned your thesis work and some of that work around carbon dioxide and deep ocean sediment.
Hmm.
So, if I'm following a timeline, this is late '80s, early '90s, mid '90s. You're doing this work and this research, and what was the thought process in deciding that that's the direction you wanted to go in as you got into your graduate work and
Yeah.
doctoral work? Is the story I'm imagining right now is climate change was already a thing at that time. We weren't necessarily paying attention to it, and I'm thinking of
Yeah.
the Rio summit in '92, where it really
Hmm.
started to get into a bit more mainstream media, if not still being ignored largely, but at least
Hmm.
we were
Hmm.
starting to have conversations, at least scientifically and a little bit globally at that time.
Right.
Is that kind of what was the direction for you, or what was that draw to get into that line of
Uh,
study?
well, again, those of you who have gone into grad school know that at some level you don't just go in there and pull some pie in the sky idea
Right.
and say this is my destiny, this is my special purpose,
Right.
and so there were a couple of projects available that I could have worked on, and that was the one I chose, which again ended up being a good decision.
Yeah.
And you talk about when I started graduate school, I handed in my final term project, and of course, in study habits and personal health considerations, I had worked probably 2 or 3 days without sleeping much to get that thing handed in on time.
Yeah.
But then had an opportunity to get on a research cruise. And essentially, I stuffed a duffel bag with enough things to get me through the trip and went down and met up with these folks and see before I even really started.
Yeah. Nice.
And, at that time in 88, we were still at the point of saying, well, we know that we can measure the increasing atmospheric CO2. But we didn't really, at that time, have a perspective of how significant those changes were in the global, sort of last million years context.
Yeah.
And so, Dave Keelan, who was actually a postdoctoral colleague of Taro Takahashi, he had established the Mongol Observatory, and he had, built the instrumentation that had the appropriate level of sensitivity and stability to be able to say, yeah, I really actually do know what the atmosphere is doing. We can measure it effectively. We can see long-term trends. And the people that mark their birth year know what the atmospheric CO2 was. I'm trying to think. I think it was about 335. Yeah, it was probably about 335 when I started grad school, maybe a little higher than that. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, the rise has accelerated.
Yeah.
And people were still saying, well, we know that, having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does in fact have this, thermal radiative effect that does in fact cause it. But we're not really sure if we can. We're not really sure if it's, if something else is going to mask that effect. And so, most of the people studying the CO2 cycle at that time were really doing for, basic science considerations. So, I was looking at sort of global ocean balances of, alkalinity and carbonate as driven by the reactions within the ocean floor. But it really wasn't, I didn't think, oh, I'm helping address a global
concern.
challenge.
Sure. It's still too early to kind of think about
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And then, by the time I get into grad school, Takahashi had published his first big compendium on, maps of ocean CO2, and it really looks like the ocean that is breathing CO2 off is actually breathing it in.
It's absorbing it. Yeah.
Yeah, not because of anything it's doing biologically, but because we're increasing the atmospheric CO2 level.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the ocean used to be a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. It's become a sink. So, understanding that became really important. And yeah, so that sort of got me in the carbon cycle world. And like I said, I was building instrumentation and observation and sampling platforms so that we could make these measurements more exhaustively with higher resolution. And that really ended up having me pretty well poised to think about how to observe and consider what's going on in the ocean in ways that aren't maybe necessarily 30 of your closest friends get on a research vessel for 6 weeks and take your turns taking samples from the sample bottles. I was building devices that you could tow behind you while it pumped water out of the ship.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we had to build new chemistry, analytical chemistry tools, generating signals so fast that the old
Couldn't keep up. Yeah.
And where it really started to become applied for me is the Pacific Northwest aquaculture shellfish aquaculture industry almost died
Mm-hmm.
in the late 2000s. And one of the hatchery managers from one of the hatcheries in Oregon, Mr. Creed, happened to go to a meeting where, you know, sort of the godfather of ocean CO2 and NOAA, really, you know, gave a talk about some research that I'd been involved in, looking at the chemistry of the water that upwells on the coast. And Alan Barton with Creek started saying, you know, I think I see, you know, in my commercial data, I think I see a link between the
Yeah.
CO2 chemistry and the problems. So we built an instrument for them that could monitor those things in real time. And then we worked really hard with them on the remediation piece, things you can do to change that chemistry. And in the context of doing that, we did some experimental work that really nailed down the mechanisms of that. And you know what ended up happening is that by putting that instrument in the hatchery and knowing how to do the chemical buffering appropriately, that effectively saved that industry. You know, so
Nice.
those hatcheries were, you know, they were deeply in the red. They were nearing bankruptcy and collapse. And now they're, because they know how to look at the ocean conditions and mitigate them. Now they're back up at, you know, above maybe what they were doing before.
Nice.
And so really it was the first time that I'd gotten into, okay, you know, this is a problem. It is caused by us. We do understand that chemistry. We do understand how to mitigate that and you know, applied that with industry. And in a lot of ways, it wasn't the hardest work I've ever done, but it certainly was the most famous. You know, people, you know, recognize that. There was all sorts of, you know, lay person attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you know, there's absolutely no shame in gathering some line. You know, if there's something you can do within your capability and it's got an application somewhere, you know,
Yeah.
you should do it and you shouldn't worry too much about, you know, the flute music. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's really kind of the spirit of this show is that story is that it's taking, you know, some incredibly complicated work that requires you and other really talented, knowledgeable experts and using that knowledge in a way that then is can be told in a story that benefits just an average lay person. Like I can understand, you know, job creation, saving jobs in a hatchery, and the economic benefits of having, you know, the seafood industry alive and the food sources. And so it's that, you know, how do we tell those stories of, you know, deeply complex work that you and others at a conference can understand, but the average citizen might not be able to understand. But that story right there ties it all together in a way that an average person can go, oh, that's why this matters. This keeps people employed, keeps food on the table, keeps economies going.
yeah,
There's obviously more to it than that, but that, in a simplified way, is what helps people understand the important work that you're doing.
one of the funny anecdotes about that whole Whiskey Creek hatchery story is that, you know, we built this instrument in my lab and installed it out there. But I had research crews, you know, grants that I had to work on that depended on me having, you know, those instruments to make those measurements.
Yeah.
And so we put the instrument in the hatchery in the spring and got around to, you know, late August, September, and I said, hey, I gotta take it back because I gotta go to sea.
Yeah.
And Stu Cudd, the hatchery owner there, Creek, said, you can't have it. You take that instrument away from me, I'm going out of business.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Wow.
so you know, we ended up, you know, sort of continuing to, you know, tweak and you know, fine tune that system. And so yeah, she's got, you know, basically maybe model one in that hatchery, still working there. We produced a couple of master's degrees out of those sets, and also, you know, basically led the way in showing that industry how do they respond to this problem.
Nice. Well, doctors, how do you transition then from doing this work, you know, ocean chemistry and carbon capture and all the studying that you're doing there, how do you transition from that into PacWave at Oregon State University
Yeah,
and into kind of some of the energy work that you're doing now?
right. Right. Well, yeah. So, like I said, I, was sort of humming happily along doing, what I was doing. But, there's sort of in academia, there are these different pathways you can take as you get to become a senior scientist. You can keep doing what you're doing. Or you can, figure out how to sort of climb into the, mahogany row of the administration buildings. And I don't know that, you know, that never really, was something that motivated me. I
Sure.
also felt like, it's okay if I do what I do until I, fall off my lab stool. Um, but there's also a lot of capability in these senior faculty that can help sort of build programs. And I had been talking to my dean at the time, saying, look, you've got all these resources with these senior faculty, and you should really have those resources. You know, we sort of, at these senior professor levels, we kind of run out of, professional development. Take advantage of this. Good. I didn't really have idea about the time. I was saying,
Yeah.
what do you think? Well, sort of, in parallel, independently, PacWave started in the College of Engineering, really led by Belinda, uh, but also on the foundation of work that others have already done, looking into the potential of wave energy. Going back to late 90s, early aughts, but with few faculty were already doing this, thinking about wave
Mm-hmm.
energy. Really, Oregon State, we definitely have a little bit of, little brother syndrome sitting between, you know, the big institutions in Washington and California. But Oregon State was really the lead on this. They were doing this work sooner than anybody else. And so Annette Bonjour and Bob Pash, were really trying to build up these capabilities before PacWave was even considered.
Yeah.
And then Department of Energy started saying, well, okay, there's this bottleneck. Some of the wave energy developers call it the valley of death, where you can design and you can build, 1/10 scale devices. You can, test them in the bathtub or a legitimate wave test facility.
Wave. Sure.
The Hinsdale Laboratory.
Yeah.
But before you can commercialize, you have to prove to somebody that you can work at full scale in a fully energetic ocean and producing the kinds of power that are municipally required. So we're talking about something that can withstand, the 45-foot waves that we dealt with during this last bomb cyclone.
Yeah.
Which are, not all that uncommon.
Yeah.
Along with, sometimes hurricane force winds. Can your device just, persist?
Yeah. Withstand that abuse. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And, let alone corrosion, sea life growth,
Sure.
and, marine mammal fallout, all those sorts of things that you don't simulate in
Right.
this time.
Right.
And then the other thing is that, you have to generate megawatt scale power, uh, and that has to be transmittable.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't
It has to be
have
useful.
a megawatt of, 9-volt batteries.
Right.
You can't send that power distance. And so the Department of Energy, sort of commissioned this feasibility study. What would a full scale grid connected test facility look like? And Belinda uh, essentially embarked on this really awesome, process where she engaged the local community. She and her team talking with the commercial fishermen before they'd even submitted a proposal, and going out and working with the different communities and trying to figure out which community really wanted this.
Would be okay with it. Right. Yeah.
And did that groundwork ahead of time. And so, our test site, for example, the location in the ocean. That was chosen by the commercial fishermen in Newport. More or less, it happened really rapidly. This is folklore for me because I wasn't there, but
Yeah.
the telling was that the group got together with a group of fishermen in Newport, and they laid out the charts, and the fishermen said, we don't really want to, give up anything.
Lose any space, sure.
But if this is coming, put it here. And so they essentially, in the span of, under an hour, looked at the charts, drew the rectangle, and that was, over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's where the site is now. So essentially, Oregon State had won the proposal, won the grant, and it had been more or less predetermined feasibility studies that it would be at. And then at the time, it really stopped being, an electrical engineering project and became an ocean infrastructure project.
Sure.
And so,
Makes sense.
it naturally made sense for the project to have a home in the College of Oceanography. College here is called Earth Ocean. But we run ships and we run large array observation systems, deep ocean coring programs. We really had ocean infrastructure.
Some of the know-how.
Know how to do that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Linda, who's a powerhouse, the folks on Mahogany Row were saying, hey, we think you should be moving up this chain. And so she took over at a dean level and essentially didn't have the bandwidth to keep doing this.
Sure.
At the same time, my dean, remembering me saying, hey, you should take advantage of us senior faculty, made a play with the university saying, oceanography will take it on, but I have to get to pick the new chief scientist for this project. And that was me, who she had in mind. And so, it came about really, really quickly. I sort of knew it was happening and knew that it had been finalized. But, a big elk hunting trip in the Elkhorn Mountains out of La Grande in Oregon. And so I, was unsuccessful, but I really wanted to
good time outside.
a week. But essentially I came out of the mountains and within a couple of days. I was back in DC talking with, undersecretaries and saying, okay, this is what it's going to take. And so that transition was, was pretty cool, right? To think that, out there on your own, in the old growth timber and in the high country, talking with the DOE leadership and water power technology.
Walking the halls of DC.
A couple of days, that was quite a transition as well.
Yeah.
So, I had the oceanographic perspective. I had a lot of my work locally with local communities on the coast. Oregon State University had sort of the credibility with the local community to be viewed as a positive partner.
Yeah.
And so that basically is where it started. And of course, having the engineer's perspective, quantitative rigor and applied science, really helped me. At the same time as that it was, also really an oceanographic problem.
Yeah.
So that's how I got there. And, it maybe, I'll say it took almost all my bandwidth.
Yeah.
And,
well, it's a big task. I mean, that's surprising. Yeah.
And I still was teaching and still trying to maintain the research program.
Sure.
And so it's been a really, it's been 7 years since I joined the project. And, in that time, we've gotten DOE's approval to go from the feasibility and permitting studies to the construction. We've finished the construction. Basically, there are a few loose ends that we're tying up.
Yeah.
The facility is built. And then we're in the process of getting the DOE's approval to move into the operational stage. As part of that, we promoted a facility director from within, Dan Moline, since before I was, is is now facility director, and the chief scientist role is really starting to diminish. What you
Sure,
do,
moving into the operations now.
yeah,
Yeah,
when you
yeah,
become operational,
yeah,
it's just much more focused on okay,
yeah,
are the electrons flowing, are the devices
yeah.
staying put?
Keeping the O&M of the process
Yeah,
alive. Right,
yeah.
right.
And so this is, I'm obviously invested in the project, but it's kind of a time where I'm sort of thinking about, okay, so now how do I transition, back into my ocean carbon cycle work?
Sure.
And really the way things are moving now is that we're thinking, we're thinking more applied, ocean engineering scale. Uh, Carbon dioxide remediation is where we go next. And colleagues at Oregon State and University of Minnesota have a project to do effectively what we showed worked with the oyster hatcheries,
Yeah.
but on a sort of automated and real time scale,
More larger scale. Yeah.
building electrolysis systems that could be powered by renewable energy to alkalize the ocean and
Hmm.
mitigate the harmful effects of ocean acidification. That's sort of where I'm, you know, refocusing, and it's
Yeah.
pretty exciting time to transition, back on PacWave, back into ocean carbonate, but not really in the pure science way that I thought about it before. Really,
Yeah.
how do we clean up this mess?
Yeah. That's a giant question. Giant question. Um, well, let me just for the sake of the audience, and my own knowledge as well, I want to make sure going back to the PacWave, and then I
Yeah,
might I may have you just on about this other topic because I know we're getting close to time too. But the whole idea of that you were talking about your next vision of work is fascinating to me as well. But while we're on the PacWave and the energy generation, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, so we myself and the audience know what you're really doing is gathering the energy from the waves of the ocean. So
yeah,
as I understand it, you have a a field, a system of buoys floating on the surface of the ocean. So as they rise and fall by the passing waves, that energy is basically captured in that motion,
yeah,
and then transferred to the shore via cables and whatnot. That's obviously incredibly simple explanation of what it is, but just for
mm-hmm.
the average layman again who might be watching this or listening to this, that's essentially the idea is that buoy energy, the up and down, rise and fall
Yeah, yeah,
of the wave generated motion is what we're trying to capture here with this exercise, and then if it proves out, you have the possibility of ocean communities. It's not going to be necessarily viable everywhere on coastlines, but it will
mm-hmm.
certainly provide a potential renewable source of energy
Mm-hmm.
for coastline communities that may be without right now. Is that, am I capturing that accurately
Yeah. I mean,
in
that's
simple terms?
well, yeah, and really nice job of that, by the way. That's great. The things that I would add to that is that PacWave. I don't want to say all we are, but what PacWave exclusively does is provides the infrastructure, uh, environmental permitting, pre-authorization, and conditional characterization of the site and the impacts of the devices. PacWave doesn't build or deploy any devices.
Okay.
And so the analogy that I've used, depending on who I'm talking to, when I was talking to CBC about it, I was saying, we build the ice rink, but we don't actually, play hockey. And I was talking to somebody at ABC New York, and I was saying, we build the opera house, but we don't actually sing any solos.
Yeah. Tailor the
And so,
story to the audience, right?
yeah, right, right. And so, football field, basketball court, whatever.
Whatever it is, right? You got to
Lots of
connect.
people who are involved in, rebuilding the Oregon State University football stadium, who, have no idea, um, you what too deep coverage means.
Right, right.
How to, coordinate special teams getting on.
Yeah, or even if they do know, they're not capable of doing it. They
Yeah.
might not be in the prime of their young
Right.
athletic life.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so, so really that we have to, keep that in mind, right?
Right.
So we don't do the devices. We are supporting the people who do that work.
Okay.
And what we're doing is providing, a level playing field for all the potential developers and all the potential different ways of capturing this power from the waves. And we have to do it obviously without bias, right? We can't say, well, we think this technology will work and this technology won't work, because we're an accredited test facility.
Right, you're testing.
Accredited, yeah. Essentially, we're validating that these devices survive the ocean, that they don't drag their anchors across the seafloor, that they don't produce acoustic signals that interfere with gray whale migration.
Yeah.
That they don't damage the seafloor in such a way that it's harmful to the Dungeness crab fishery.
Right.
So that's what we do, and then we provide
all those things,
cable.
and ultimately producing enough energy that makes it a viable source. Right. So keeping all of those other downside factors in mind while you're also looking for the upside, which is, are you adequately capturing a renewable resource?
Right.
Right.
And so then we've got these subsea cables. I'm trying to remember what the number is. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 kilometers of subsea cables that are each capable of transmitting. I think we're rated for 5 megawatts. The cables themselves were permitted for 5 megawatts per cable, 4 separate cables. So that's a 20 megawatt capable facility. Looks to us like the cables could withstand maybe 8 megawatts, running at what the industry calls medium voltage, which is in our case up to 35,000 volts, and then able to transmit those megawatt scale outputs from the devices back these 20 kilometers per cable on the seafloor, under the beach, under Highway 101, up to our shoreside facility where the power gets conditioned and then ultimately connected to the local grid.
Then transitioned out,
so
right?
Wow. And in that process, what comes out of these developers' conditioning and device production numbers is something that we meter with, industry standard power metering systems, verify that it is in fact what the developers say it is.
Yeah.
Ensure that what goes onto the grid is in fact grid compatible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really an important point there. And then to talk about, how that power is converted from, the oscillatory motion of the waves into electrons. That's kind of the Wild West right now. And if your listeners or you spend, 15 minutes Googling wave energy converter, what you'll see is that there's no convergence.
Yeah. There's a whole, I did a little bit of that before this episode. Just kind of there is a number of it's testing, right? I mean, it's everybody coming up with their engineering concept and putting it into practice to see what might rise to the surface as the most viable.
And then circling back to sort of me growing up in Eastern Washington and thinking about it's really windy there.
Sure.
And the way Seattleites think about rain impacting their lives, folks in the Columbia Basin think about wind. And the people who, there was a T-shirt at one point that says the Tri-Cities, it doesn't suck in the Tri-Cities,
it blows.
But I remember, as a kid out, pheasant hunting, duck hunting, driving around with my dad, and once in a while you'd see these weird contraptions, and oh yeah, that's a wind
turbine, yeah.
But there was really no convergence then. There were things that looked like old school, Dutch windmills, things that looked like sort of vertical spiraling ribbons, So there wasn't convergence there. And what got that convergence was tested at places like the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Boulder. And and now, you look at any turbine anywhere, the turbines that you see off of Kihei and Maui, the turbines that you see in they're all the same.
Yeah,
They've
West
all
Texas.
got that same, three-blade design, and ultimately they've optimized, what works best, and there's this convergence. So ideally, what we hope is that, the wave energy test site will allow folks to go from saying, yeah, this concept, if you put it in some waves, it makes some electrons, but maybe it's not the most optimal. Maybe it's got too many moving parts. Maybe it's, got some inherent inefficiencies that can't really be realized until you're in a real ocean.
Right.
Or, what we say is that because Oregon's got this really diverse wave climate, we say, hey, this kind of device works great on the big swells that come up the North Pacific in the wintertime. This kind of device works really great in the wind waves that we see in the summertime. So you can target technologies for environments. And then, the last thing I'll say in that regard is that, in the Northwest, we've got sort of a embarrassment of riches. And so, there are some people who would argue that the hydropower industry isn't quite green, but it is renewable and it makes our electricity incredibly cheap.
Affordable, right?
Right. Which is great for us. It's terrible for a wave energy developer who can't compete.
Sure. Makes sense. Yeah.
And so, ultimately, our wholesale energy price is 3.5 cents per kilowatt. And that's more or less the Monaco Power Administration prohibits anyone from charging, even if there were the. But if you look at Hawaii is about 50 cents a kilowatt. You think about Kodiak Island and Alaska. So it's very likely that the devices that we test here, the PacWave tests off Oregon, it's very likely that that technology doesn't produce municipal power.
Doesn't reside here, right?
It goes somewhere,
right?
Where it's economically feasible for the developer and fits a need.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. But you got to have a place to, like you said, test it and standardize it so that you can proof of concept, make sure it works. So, yeah. Well, Dr. Hales, thank you so much. I know we're getting close to an hour of chatting, and I could keep chatting with you for much longer. I'm fascinated by your work, and maybe someday I'd love to have you come back and talk about your next phase of career work, because that is very intriguing to me as well. But I want to kind of wind this conversation down out of respect for your time, and ask you what's your call to action now that everybody's listened to this or watched this episode and have learned a bit more about the PacWave research and testing that's going on for wave energy. What do you want folks to do with this information? What's your call to action?
Well, I think one of the things we say about wave is that it's 20 years behind. And so, do I think, PacWave will test a device that appears to be commercially viable that is ultimately deployed in another location? Absolutely. When do I think that's going to happen? Well, not next year. Do I think it's going to happen in 5 years? That's my guess, is that we will have a device that at the end of a couple of years of testing in our facility will be shown to be viable to augment power sources. The first thing is that people need to understand that all of this takes time.
Sure.
And the other thing that people need to understand is that when we're talking about renewables, there is no single solution. And so when people say, well, wave might produce 15% of U.S. electricity demand. Well, it's not going to happen, tomorrow.
Right.
And people will say, well, if it's only 15%, why bother? And the thing about that is that, I've used this analogy. The renewables require this diversified portfolio of contributors. And the thing about wave is that it's predictable and it's much more persistent than wind or solar, right? And so we know that the solar systems don't produce power when the sun is down, but the waves don't stop.
Right.
And so, we often talk about wave being sort of, the tortoise to the solar's hair, right? And or wave being your guaranteed low yield, component account, and wind being the volatile tech stock, and so that people need to understand that we have to have this collective level solution that what really is a problem.
Yeah.
We're in a space where objective truth is being found.
Yes.
And
Yes, it is.
it is objectively true that we have a carbon problem, and it's causing impacts to people's lives and we have to figure out how to move beyond that. Saying, well, we're not going to try this one thing because it's only a sixth or a fifth of what we need. We have to have this diversity of sources. So, so that's really sort of where we are as far as ways. Is there a call to action? You know, yeah, I guess it is.
Yeah,
If you
I
want
see one in there.
people to be, if you want people to increase their awareness and facilitate the connection to objective truth, yeah,
Yep.
that's a call to action. Right? It's hard to imagine that it's a challenge.
That's where we are.
That's where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the call. That's what I heard in your call is for people to educate themselves on these objective truths. Be patient but persistent with the implications of and implementation of renewable sources, because that's where we are. That's what's needed, and recognize those different percentages are valuable, even if they might seem small. If we can reduce our dependence on fossil fuels by 15% along our coastlines, that actually has that adds up. That starts having a compounding benefit. So
and again, the this carbon dioxide remediation, I think that's going to be the next sort of high profile, environmental engineering undertaking. And it's harder than people think it is, and there's a huge number of charlatans out there pitching their next thing.
Yeah.
And it's something that we have to do, right? We have to be able to figure out how to mitigate these effects that are out there. Yeah. But you also, have to understand that the easiest mess to clean up is the one you don't make. Right? So, these things go hand in hand. Right?
Yep.
So if you're out there, shoveling dog poop out of your yard and your neighbor is throwing it right back over the fence, then you really haven't solved any problem.
Right. Right.
So we need to figure out, okay, these things go hand in hand. How do we help people who are most impacted in ways that don't end up having negative blowback? And how do we keep ourselves from making this grow?
Right. Right. Well, could not agree more with that assessment. So, let me transition you here, Dr. Hales, into the last little bit of the show. Every episode ends with me asking the guests the same 3 questions. We talk on this show about hard subjects, right? Climate change is difficult. How are we going to, solve some of the dilemmas that we find ourselves in? These are hard challenges. They can be full of anxiety and worry and real life consequences that are damaging and deadly, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at hope, not as a fuzzy emotion, but more in the sense of how hope has been studied to be shown as, if you have a vision for a better future, you have a plan of action that you can take to get there, and you have a sense of agency that you have something that you can do to make it happen. that hope can be very powerful.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about hope. I'm going to ask you three questions, just to ask you to give your kind of gut reaction to these questions, and would love to kind of get your sense about what you're hopeful for. So if you're ready, here are the hopeful questions. Question number one for you is, what is your vision for a better future? It can be for you personally, professionally, or for the world. What's your vision for a better future?
Oh, wow. Well, that's hopelessly, pun intended, uh, wide open. Well, I think ultimately, these are problems of scales that collectively solve, right? And so that's what I hope is that people figure out, how to move beyond what directly and exclusively addresses one thing. Thinking about, okay, the carbon dioxide. This is a great statistic that my colleague David Archer shared with me. But carbon dioxide, it's not it's a locally produced problem, but it's globally distributed. So
Yeah,
the idea that a
yeah,
carbon dioxide that you encounter in Seattle, you know, came from Seattle is extremely low.
yeah.
And so carbon dioxide, once it's emitted, uh, it's got a lifetime in the atmosphere, something like 40 years.
Wow.
And so, the mixing time of the atmosphere is, weeks, right? And so as soon as that CO2 is emitted, it's effectively, distributed globally. Uh, and so, it can't be just, hey, we're going to go electric. We're going to do ocean optimization. It has to be the sort of global approach. Figuring out how to do that in a way that, uh, you know, the, socioeconomic global powers come together. That's what we have to do to solve this problem.
Yeah,
And, it's not, that's not that far fetched, right? I mean, people have come together to solve problems like disease, you know, it's more successful than others.
yeah,
Yeah. And so it's something that we have to understand. It's not a it's not a Chinese problem. Everybody's got to figure out.
yeah.
And the really great statistic that shared with me is that the carbon dioxide that's released when you burn a tank of gas in your car stays in the atmosphere so long and traps so much energy over its lifetime that if you could capture the energy that the carbon dioxide traps, that one tank of gas traps enough energy for you to drive a car around the world.
Wow, wow.
So, again, it's this really extended lifetime,
Yeah,
globally
wow.
distributed
And
issue.
I hadn't
So
heard that
yeah,
statistic
right.
before. Yeah,
So, so yeah, I guess that's my hope is that, we figure out this collective approach to solving the problem. Recognize that solving it, is the rising tide that floats all boats. Something that,
right. So you touched on this uh, a little bit in what you've already described, but your answer to the second question may have already been stated, but just to give you a chance to elaborate, if you will, the second question is, why is it your hope that we need to look at these problems and solutions holistically and collectively and globally? I know you touched on it already, but is there anything else
yeah.
you want to add to the why of that hope?
Well, I think, um, you know, philosophically, you look at the things that human engineering have done, and you really can't argue that those have been exclusively negative, right? And so, you think about, the Bornheimer process, right? Where we learned how to capture nitrogen, which is in vast abundance in the atmosphere, to make fertilizer, right? And so, effectively, that's an engineering process that gives us at least the technology to effectively end hunger,
Yeah,
right? Excuse me. Uh, and, you think about, you know, ultimately the internal combustion engine, right? And
Yeah.
so, you think about things that we talk about like horsepower, right? And horsepower is a unit of power that was defined, back in, I think, the 1700s. I should know that. Essentially, it's the amount of power that these early engineers thought a good horse could produce continuously throughout the day,
Yeah.
right? And if anybody's ever done this, this happens in classes all the time. You can actually, figure out what it takes for you to produce a horsepower, right? So you can get on your assault bike, right? Or time yourself running up and down stairs in a building.
Right.
For sort of an average human to produce horsepower, it is it's exhausting, right? And to think that, number one, a horse can do that steadily throughout a day is kind of mind blowing.
Yeah.
And then you think about, the what the internal combustion engines are doing, right? The the big diesel pickups that are actually available. I think they're running 550 horsepower,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, the ability effectively to build infrastructure, to build transportation, you know, to, again, that we will, to eliminate, cold stress upon humans. That ultimately comes back to harnessing internal combustion. Right?
Yeah.
And internal combustion is, it's this, what do you call it? Dependence forming, because not only is the energy inherent in fossil organic fuels, but it's so storable and transportable.
Right. Right.
And so, we can do things that have benefited society because we've harnessed the internal combustion
This
system,
energy. Right. Right.
right? In ways that, are just unthinkable to people, a few hundred years ago.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Uh, and then, you also think about, you go back to health, right? And the understanding of the microbial world, right? Pasteur and Florence Henderson and Salk, right? And so you think about our understanding of infectious disease, right? How that has changed, lifespans, quality of life.
Right.
Those are the positives of human ingenuity. Right? Now, where we run into trouble is that we sometimes don't understand,
Sure.
right? And we don't think far enough down the road about the consequences.
Unintended consequences. Right. Right.
And then following that, we often clean up messes in ways that ultimately create more messes.
Just move
And
it
so,
around. Right.
I'm sure you and I'm sure many of your listeners know the rat and the mongoose problem.
Yeah.
So rats got introduced to these communities, shipping, they don't have predators, they take over. Somebody said, well, mongooses kill anything. Let's bring mongooses in. And then it turns out that the mongooses are diurnal and the rats are nocturnal, and so the mongooses don't eat the rats, and now we've got a mongoose problem.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
so, again, it's one of these things where what you really hope people do when they're thinking about solving these problems is that they don't, like I said, throw the dog poop over the fence,
Right.
and just move the problem elsewhere.
Right.
And many of these carbon dioxide remediation approaches are very, very poorly vetted from end to end. Right? Where you say, okay, we're going to take out this much carbon dioxide, and that's good. But it's like looking at the deposits side of your ledger sheet in your bank account and not thinking about the withdrawal.
What you're
Can
doing.
you
Yep.
do this CO2 removal without producing CO2 elsewhere? Right? That end-to-end quantitative objectivity about these processes, you have to meet.
Right. Well, let me ask you then the third question here. So we've got a hope of a better future where people are looking holistically and globally. They're doing that, for the betterment of humanity and betterment of the our only home, the world we have to live on and share with other creatures, and they're really trying to look end to end and find solutions that don't create new problems. So let's now imagine for a moment that that's actually the world that we're living in, that your future hope is actually come true, and that's the world that we're living in right now. So how does that make you feel, that that's the world we're living in right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, is there any answer other than good?
Whatever answer you have is the right answer. There is no wrong
Yeah,
answer.
right.
It's just
I
kind
mean,
of
yeah, that would be tremendous, right? If we could do that and figure out ways that, we, you know, broker or combine use of resources, because all these problems are becoming global, and manage that in an effective way, yeah, I feel great about that.
yeah.
And, I'm sure there's some Orwellian downside with some of it. I'll take it.
Yeah, I would take it too. I'll
I'll
take it
take
too.
that risk.
That is what we're working towards. That's certainly the future that I'm trying to work towards as well. So, well, Dr. Hales, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and helping me understand what you're working on, the great work that you're doing, and really, I'll probably follow up with you at some point. I do want to pick your brain about some of the other work that you're transitioning into, and I wish you all the best with PacWave and your future endeavors with going back into the carbon side of oceanography work. So
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And, if there are questions, technical, things that I didn't, left you thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, feel free to reach out again.
perfect. And I'll put the PacWave website on our show notes for anybody else to do their own research and get to know you a little bit better that way as well. So
All right.
with
All
that,
right.
Dr. Hales, I wish you all the best.
All right. Thanks.
All
Happy
right.
holidays.
Happy holidays as well. Take care.
All right. We'll see you.
And that brings us to the end of another fascinating episode of Stories Sustain Us. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Dr. Burke Hales for sharing his incredible journey with us today. From his roots in Washington State to his pioneering work in oceanography and wave energy research, Dr. Hales has provided us with invaluable insights into the complex world of ocean chemistry and renewable energy. His dedication to addressing climate change through innovative projects like PacWave and his emphasis on the importance of community engagement truly underscore the power of applied science in tackling real-world challenges. Dr. Hales' vision for a sustainable future, grounded in collective efforts and a diverse approach to renewable energy, is both inspiring and essential. Please join me in thanking Dr. Hales for his groundbreaking work and for reminding us all that the easiest mess to clean up is the one that we don't make. Dr. Hales' commitment to creating a healthier planet is a beacon of hope and a call to action for all of us. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and family, leave me a review, and subscribe to Stories Sustain Us wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you as always for your support, and I encourage you to stay curious, stay inspired, and continue to embrace sustainability in your own lives. And be sure to join me next week on Stories Sustain Us, when I'll be speaking with the CEO of a metal recycling company. Now, most people, I imagine, are very familiar with recycling plastics and paper, but the significance of recycling metal is often not fully understood or appreciated. So join me on February 4th to be inspired by the personal story of my guest as we talk about social justice programs in the United States and Latin America, the circular economy, and the metal recycling industry's important role in local and global sustainability efforts. It's an incredible story about my guest's career supporting sustainability around the world. You're not going to want to miss it, so check it out on February 4th at storiessustainus.com, wherever you listen to podcasts, and on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Stephen Shower. Please take care of yourself and each other. Take care.